He didn't just change economics. He changed how governments think about fear, power, and money. John Maynard Keynes was not a politician or a revolutionary, at least not in the usual way. He was something rarer, a man who taught entire nations how to spend their way out of despair. For centuries, debt was considered a sin. Deficits were viewed as moral failure. Balanced budgets were seen as a sign of honest government, a kind of financial purity. But Keynes completely flipped that idea. He said spending during hard times wasn't reckless. It was responsible. He made debt sound necessary and saving sound selfish. By doing this, he changed the logic of capitalism itself. Welcome to Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it seems. The story begins in the ruins of the Great Depression. Imagine the world in 1930. Banks failing, factories silent, millions unemployed. The old economic rule book, based on Adam Smith and the invisible hand, said the market would fix itself. Supply and demand would rebalance. Prices would fall. People would start buying again. Recovery, in theory, was automatic. But theory doesn't feed a starving family. In reality, demand didn't return. Factories stayed shut. People, scared of losing the little they had, stopped spending altogether. The economy wasn't healing. It was freezing. This is what Keynes saw, and he realized something bold. Markets are not perfect. They don't always repair themselves. Sometimes they get trapped in a cycle of fear. When people stop spending, businesses stop hiring. When businesses stop hiring, incomes fall. And when incomes fall, spending drops even more. It becomes a spiral, a kind of economic black hole. Keynes saw that the real problem wasn't too much spending. It was too little. The system had lost its flow of money. In simple words, recessions happen when everyone tries to save at the same time, and that shared fear makes everyone poorer. He called this the paradox of thrift. What is wise for one family, cutting expenses and saving, becomes dangerous when everyone does it, because one person's spending is another person's income. When spending dies, the economy's heart stops beating. So Keynes suggested something shocking. If private demand collapses, public demand must replace it. The government must step in, borrow money, hire workers, build things, and put money back into people's hands. That money creates jobs. Jobs create income. Income creates spending. And spending restarts the economic engine. To old economists, this sounded insane. Governments weren't supposed to interfere. Deficits were dangerous. Debt was a curse. But Keynes believed something different. Timing mattered. He argued that government should act opposite to the economic cycle. Spend during downturns, save during booms. Use stimulus and restraint, not just one, but both. He used a simple example. The economy is like a car. Normally, the private sector drives. But when the engine stalls, the government must turn the key and add fuel until it starts again. Once the engine runs, the government pulls back. This is how you keep the system moving. In his 1936 book, The General Theory, Keynes built this into a full framework. He introduced a key idea, aggregate demand, the total spending in an economy. When that spending falls, production and jobs fall too. And the only way to fix it is to increase spending, directly or indirectly, until confidence returns. But this wasn't only about numbers. Keynes believed economics was about psychology. He said markets are driven by animal spirits, people's hopes, fears, and instincts about the future. You can't fix that with formulas. You fix it with action, clear, confident, visible action. When governments spend, they don't just hire workers or buy materials. They send a signal. We believe recovery is possible. That belief becomes economic energy. Keynes understood that confidence, not austerity, ends recessions. But his ideas didn't spread quickly. In the early 1930s, leaders still trusted austerity. Britain returned to the gold standard, hurting its own exports. Germany cut spending to look disciplined and pushed its economy into chaos, opening the door to extremism. And in the U.S., President Hoover refused major intervention, convinced the market would fix itself. It didn't. By 1933, 25% of Americans were unemployed. Banks were destroying people's savings. The free market had frozen. Then Franklin D. Roosevelt arrived, not an economist, but someone whose instincts matched Keynes's ideas. He didn't call it Keynesian economics yet, but the logic was the same. When fear stops people from spending, the government must spend instead. Roosevelt's New Deal wasn't one plan. It was a whole philosophy. Huge public works like the TVA and Hoover Dam employed millions. The WPA gave work to artists, teachers, and builders. The government became the country's biggest customer, pumping wages into the economy. Slowly it worked. Demand returned. Confidence rose. By the late 1930s, America was recovering, but not fully healed. It took something even bigger and darker to prove Keynes was right. That event was World War II. When war began, governments everywhere did exactly what Keynes had urged. They spent without hesitation. Factories reopened to build tanks, planes, and ships. Governments borrowed huge amounts, not to stimulate the economy, but to survive. And for the first time ever, unemployment disappeared during a global crisis. The irony was harsh. Total war became the ultimate test of Keynesian economics. And it worked. Production soared. Incomes rose. Economies revived, even while the world was on fire. It wasn't real prosperity, but it proved something. Government spending could end a depression. When the war ended, Keynes's ideas weren't just accepted. They became the new foundation of global economics. His influence shaped everything afterward. Bretton Woods, post-war rebuilding, welfare states, and the golden age of growth from 1945 to 1973. Keynes gave capitalism a second life, one guided by policy, managed by governments, and built on the idea that prosperity comes from movement, not austerity. But like every powerful idea, it had a hidden cost. Once governments learned that spending could fix any crisis, they also learned they didn't need to stop. After World War II, Keynes wasn't just an economist. He became almost prophetic. Countries rebuilt using his formula. They saw that debt could buy time, spending could buy stability, and full employment could buy peace. Europe was destroyed, but Keynes's logic made recovery seem possible. The Marshall Plan, welfare states, and modern social contracts all grew from his core idea: never let demand die. Factories that made weapons now made cars, radios, and appliances. Soldiers returned to jobs building the modern world. And behind this boom was a silent revolution. Governments no longer waited for markets. They managed them. During the 1950s and 60s, Keynesian economics became the operating system of the free world. Public works, cheap credit, unemployment insurance, housing, infrastructure, all tools to keep the economy stable. Recessions became shorter. Recoveries became faster. The business cycle, once seen as fate, now looked controllable. For the first time, capitalism was on a leash, and Keynes had handed that leash to the state. But success created dependence. The more governments used spending to calm downturns, the harder it became to stop. Voters loved stimulus, but hated saving. Keynes's rule, to save during good times, was ignored. By the late 1960s, the system began to overheat. Prices rose. Wages followed. The balance between growth and inflation broke. And when the 1970s oil crisis hit, the world discovered the limits of Keynesian control. Stagflation, high unemployment and high inflation, wasn't supposed to be possible. According to Keynesian theory, they shouldn't happen together. But oil prices broke the rules. Economies were flooded with money, but starved of energy. Governments tried to spend their way out, but spending only pushed prices higher. Confidence collapsed. Faith in Keynes faded. A new school of thought rose, monetarism, led by Milton Friedman and the Chicago School. They blamed government interference for distorting markets. They argued inflation was always caused by too much money chasing too few goods. For a moment, it looked like Keynes's era was over. But economic ideas don't die, they evolve. Even when governments embraced austerity and deregulation in the 1980s, Keynes's core idea, government intervention, never fully disappeared. It simply waited for the next crisis. That crisis arrived in 2008. When global markets crash, governments return to their old reflex: spend. The same leaders who preach restraint suddenly use massive stimulus. Bailouts, stimulus packages, quantitative easing. Keynes's playbook, but on a scale he never imagined. Trillions were created. Interest rates dropped to zero. Central banks didn't just guide the economy. They became the economy. And once again, spending worked at first. The system was saved. Confidence returned. But a new problem appeared, one Keynes never predicted. He assumed government spending would flow to workers and industries. But in the modern world, money flows differently. Stimulus went into financial markets instead of everyday life. It inflated asset prices, not wages. Stocks soared. Housing exploded. Inequality grew. Governments had learned how to restart the engine, but now they were overheating the wrong part. Then came the pandemic. Keynes revived once again. Governments didn't hesitate. They borrowed and spent at record speed. Money went straight into people's accounts. Central banks printed trillions overnight. It was pure Keynesianism, maximum spending, zero restraint. For a moment, it felt miraculous. Unemployment fell. Markets hit highs. Even with the world shut down, economies seemed alive. But soon, the bill came due. Inflation surged. Supply chains broke. The cure that saved the system also weakened it. Keynes designed a tool to stabilize capitalism. But what happens when that tool becomes the entire system? Today, almost 100 years after General Theory, Keynes's ideas are everywhere, and that's part of the problem. Whenever growth slows, governments reach for the same solution: spend, borrow, stimulate, repeat. But each rescue makes the economy more dependent and more fragile. The state is no longer the spender of last resort. It has become the spender of first resort, sometimes the only spender left. Politicians now use Keynesian tools without Keynesian discipline. They run deficits in good times and bad. They spend not to stabilize the economy, but to stay popular. The balance Keynes imagined, discipline in good times, support in bad times, has turned into permanent stimulus. Yet his brilliance still remains. Keynes didn't give governments a blank check. He gave them a lesson. He showed that economics is not just math. It's psychology, belief, trust. When people lose faith in the future, they stop spending. And when spending stops, economies die. Keynes built a theory to keep that belief alive, even when everything else failed. But here's the dark truth. The modern world runs on belief without limits. The system Keynes saved has turned his medicine into an addiction. Every time a crisis hits, we spend. And every time we spend, the tolerance for pain gets lower. Today's markets don't fear recession. They fear withdrawal. Keynes once said, "In the long run, we are all dead." He meant as a challenge. Don't wait forever for the market to fix everything. But over time, it became an excuse, a license to borrow endlessly, push problems forward, and live permanently in the short run. And that is the great irony of John Maynard Keynes. He didn't destroy capitalism. He saved it again and again. But in saving it, he also made it vulnerable, dependent, fragile. The man who taught governments to spend also taught them to forget restraint. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has answers, and I'll show you where to find them.